I count myself very fortunate because I'm often contacted by young people, especially young men who are struggling with their own Christian faith. I'm really glad to see young, vital men thinking about the things of Christ. But it's not easy. When you're in your late teens, early 20s, and you're a male, you are driven by endless amounts of testosterone. And you got to figure out how to deal with that. How do you cope with that? It's just a fact that the male mind drifts towards thoughts of sex quite constantly. And so what do? How do we keep that in check? How do we go about our daily Christian life without being overly influenced by the testosterone? Well, that's really, really hard to do in the society in which we live because we are inundated with hypersexual images. You can't turn on the TV without somebody selling you something on the basis of sexuality. You can't drive down the freeway without seeing large signs that have sexual images on them. And as you well know, you can't tune into YouTube or really any place else on the internet without ads and pop-ups and images that are designed to catch your prurient nature and draw you in order to sell you something, in order to get you to click on something, in order to get you to open your wallet and purchase yet another thing on the basis of attractive sexual imagery. It's everywhere. And it's really, really difficult, again, if you're fueled by testosterone, to avert your eyes and avert your thoughts and do what Paul said and take every thought captive. It's really tough. And so sometimes young men give in. They give in to those images. Sometimes a couple clicks of the mouse, next thing they know, they're looking at pornographic images. Now, when I was young, which was back just after the flood, it's a long time ago, when I was young, it was difficult to see images, sexual images of women. You really had to exert some effort. Maybe you had a friend whose dad had a box hidden in the back of a closet somewhere. So you really had to go through some real effort to see images of women. It's not that way today. Nowadays, anybody, any child, can sit down with a few clicks of the mouse, whether they mean to or not. They end up at a pornographic website. I know what it's like, and I know how tempting it is. And so I get email from young men saying, what's really wrong with pornography? And does the Bible actually say that you shouldn't look at pornography? Well, it does. Actually, our English word, pornography, or the shortened nickname now, porn, comes to us directly from the Greek language, pornos. That's a word that is translated adulterer, or in the King James, whoremongerer. Porneia is the word for anything that is sexual outside of marriage. The Bible's very clear that the marriage bed is not defiled. Sex within marriage is the only legitimate, biblically acceptable form of sexuality. But if you think about it, Jesus said that if you look on a woman with lust in your heart, you're guilty as an adulterer. And that means every time you click on a pornographic image, you are guilty as an adulterer. You are guilty of pornos. And so the word pornography is in fact addressed in the Bible, and it's used as a catch-all for everything that is outside of marriage, whether we're talking about adultery, whether we're talking about paying for sex, whether we're talking about anything that is not the marriage bed, then you are engaging in pornos and you are committing sin. It's just that simple. Now that's the biblical answer. That's the theological answer. But let me talk to you for a moment about the human cost of pornography. You see, most of the young men I talk to either want to get married or are already married. They're in young marriages. And the simple fact of the matter is, pornography warps your view of what womanhood is. and you start thinking about what your wife or your girlfriend ought to be like, because the images that you've seen in pornography have warped your view of womanhood. There's no woman, there's no girl out there who can actually live up to the imagination of a pornographically fueled young man. You'll start thinking that your wife, your girlfriend, is going to engage in all the stuff you've seen on the web. And she's not. In fact, for a marriage to work, for a relationship to work, you've got to actually be communicating all the time about what is acceptable for both of you, what is pleasurable for both of you. And if you start thinking that what your wife is willing and not willing to do is not acceptable based on your imaginary pornographic images, the next thing that happens is you're going to blame her because she's not living up. She's not being the way you think she ought to be. And it's not really her fault. It's your fault because you came into the marriage with wrong-headed pornographic notions of what sexuality is. God gave us sexuality on purpose, and he made it enjoyable on purpose so that procreation would happen and so that the earth would be filled with people. But what happens far too often is that people get these pornographic ideas in their head, and they start thinking, when I get married, this is what it's going to be like all the time, every time, woohoo! And that's not reality. And the shame, the real crime here is the woman who gets blamed is not to blame. She's just being herself. And the male image of what she ought to be is not realistic. It's fantastic. It's fantasy. And so the damage gets done because he starts blaming her, and she's caught in that vicious cycle of either trying to engage in things that she doesn't like or that she even is repulsed by in order to please her husband. Or she says no to it, and then he gets angry, and he feels like she's not living up to her obligation in the marriage. He blames her. She dislikes herself. She starts hating herself for not living up to her husband's expectations. You can see the vicious cycle. It never goes well. And it all starts with that first essential problem, which is that the man brought pornography into the marriage. He brought pornographic imagery and fantasy notions of sex into his relationship. And then, when his poor wife doesn't live up to that fantasy imagery, she gets blamed. And then she gets belittled. And then her self-image, her own self-esteem goes right down the tank. And then she doesn't want to have sex with him because, after all, that opens the door to criticism. So she pulls away, he blames her more, and things just go from bad to worse. And that's all the result of pornography. I've seen it time and time and time again. In my role as a pastor, people bring the intimate details of their life and their marriage to me. And I can't begin to tell you the countless times that the problem between the two of them is that she feels belittled, she feels that her self-worth has been completely undermined, and he feels like she's not living up because she is not like his fantasy images. We got to get back to reality. Marriage is tough work, and it starts with acceptance and forgiveness and being willing to accept the other person for exactly who they are. So, start out on a good foot. Start out accepting your wife for exactly who she is. And make sure that she knows that she is your ideal woman. That when you look at her, you see everything that womanhood and femininity was meant to be. And then don't compare. Because you can't compare her, the real live woman you live with every day and share a bed with every night. You can't compare her to the images that you see on the internet. Look, Let's be realistic. Pornography does nobody any good. Oh, I've heard the excuses. I've heard the people who say, well, when my wife's not willing to engage me sexually, pornography becomes a kind of release, so actually it's good for my marriage. But if Jesus was being honest when he said that you're looking at another woman and lusting after her is actually adultery, you have to ask yourself whether adultery is good for your marriage. The answer is no. Plus, as a Christian man, once you've engaged in any kind of pornographic activity, you can't help but feel bad. The Holy Spirit inside you is going to convict you of what you've just done, and you come away feeling ashamed. Nothing good ever comes from it. Now, is it easy to avoid? No. You have to work really hard to avoid it. But is it worth avoiding? Well, the answer is unequivocal. Yes, it's worth avoiding. Your marriage will benefit from it. And more importantly, your image of what women ought to be will be improved by it. Listen, I have a 21-year-old daughter. I know I talk about her a lot, but man, I love her like crazy. And I would hate to think that some guy's image of my daughter and who she ought to be has been informed by internet pornography. I would try to keep my daughter as far away from that kind of man as I possibly could. I hope she finds a Christian man who has kept himself as pure as she has kept herself, and that they can look at each other on their marriage night and know that they accept each other for who they are and look at each other as the quintessential man and the quintessential woman. Now, isn't that what you want for your wife? I know that's what your wife wants from you. So, is pornography harmful? In more ways than you can possibly count. And is it denounced biblically? Yes, absolutely. So now, what are you going to do about that?